Good morning. You might open your Bibles to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. We'll be spending most of our time in that passage, so you might want to mark it when you find that opening. I was given a fan to put in the pulpit, and it's my new favorite toy. So I had a reason to study this passage a little bit over the past couple of weeks, and there were some things that I saw that I guess I've never seen before that I probably should have, but really just makes this beautiful passage even deeper, I think, at least for my understanding. And so I wanted to share some of that with you this morning and maybe make this powerful passage just a little more meaningful to you and maybe help you see some connections. Maybe you've already seen, I don't know. But we'll certainly try to work through them this morning. John chapter 1, beginning there in verse 1. Very familiar passage. I imagine most of us know the first few words of the book of John. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. And He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through Him. And apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. Some interesting information that we're given there. And let me ask you to do something with me this morning as we're going through this. Pretend like you've never read it before. Pretend like for just a moment that this is new information to you. Maybe you're not even super familiar with the rest of the Bible, and God is just a concept you've kind of heard talked about. Now let's kind of follow through John's line of thinking. There's a God. I think we've all known that for a long time. Anywhere you go on this planet, people are aware of that. They may think there's more than one. They may have a different idea of who God is, but we all have some notion of God. And what we find out that is in the beginning, there were two beings. One of them called God in verse 1, and one of them called the Word. But what we find out is not only that there were two beings, but then in that last clause of verse 1, we find out that the Word was God. So whatever we know about the divine nature, we now know that it can be shared, that more than one person or individual possesses that divine nature. Verse 2, He was in the beginning with God. Verse 3, all things came into being through Him. And apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. So here we are. We've got God. We've got a second person who is also divine. It just kind of helps us understand how divine this second person is, this Word is. We find out that He's the Creator. That He has done what God alone can do. This is going to get to be a habit. I'm just going to have to breathe a little bit at the beginning of my sermons until we get past this. So here He is. He's God. He's doing what God and God alone can do. And that makes Him, or at least in my mind, solidifies and concretes this idea of His Godship. And here's why I asked you to pretend as if you weren't aware of this or familiar with this. Verse 14. You know, if I don't know the rest of the gospel story, and I don't know how this all goes, verse 14 may be some of the most shocking words that you could possibly imagine to be in John chapter 1. Because whatever God is, it seems pretty obvious that He is separate and apart from the human experience. That He's not in the midst of all this suffering, that He doesn't have to deal with that. It seems like most ideas of God, most ideas of the divine, at least agree on that. Then we've got verse 14. This divine person, this one who is God, this one who can do what God alone can do, became flesh. That's something to meditate on for a moment. And we might wonder, well, what does it mean that He became flesh? And we'll get into that for just a moment. But the passage helps us out a little bit. He became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw His glory. Glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So I want to work through these phrases a little bit with you, and we won't get too deep, but I think there's some things here that we need to think about. Put your marker there in John chapter 1, and let's talk about this idea of becoming flesh. And I'm going to start in Hebrews chapter 2, to try to understand what does this mean, this person who is God, who creates, became flesh. Of course, if we kept reading in the book of John, we'd quickly find out the Word is Jesus. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9, but we do see Him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus. Listen to this. Because of, or in order to, the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor. What does it mean that the Word became flesh? Well, I don't know that I'll ever know all the details of that. I don't know that I'll ever understand fully what that means, but here's what I do know. That whatever prevented the Word from experiencing death changed. Something was done in this becoming flesh that allowed Him to experience death. But it's not just death in the book of Hebrews, is it? It's everything that's inherent in the human condition. He talks here about suffering, verse 10. He calls us His children and brethren in verse 14. He talks about the temptation of Christ in verses 17 and 18. Turn over to Philippians chapter 2 with me. And again, here we've got the Apostle Paul, and it's almost a parallel passage in some ways to John chapter 1. As a matter of fact, I think Philippians chapter 2 may kind of explain some things for us from John chapter 1. I want you to notice there in verse 6, talking about Christ Jesus, he mentions in verse 5, who although He existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself, taking on, listen to this, the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. That word form is kind of interesting. It's the Greek term morphe, and we could probably spend all week talking about what that word means. It's a pretty deep word, especially in this Christological context. But I want you to notice something. He existed in the form of God, and He took on the form of a bondservant. Same term. And so whatever it means about God, it means about the bondservant. Vincent would tell you that it's the kind of outward manifestation of His actual essence. In other words, it's how God manifests Himself as God. We might think at least about rights, prerogatives, and privileges. Jesus dwelt in unapproachable light right up until the incarnation. Jesus was above and beyond physical pain and suffering right up until the incarnation. He was not directly affected, at least not the way that we are, by suffering. Temptation could not reach Him. All of these things are part of this form. And notice what He does. He takes the form of a bondservant. I'm reading from the New American Standard. I really like the King James Version there in verse 7. It says, He made Himself of no reputation. He made Himself of no reputation, taking the form of a servant, being found in the likeness of man. He made Himself of no reputation. Verse 6 there at the end of it says that He did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. And I like the New American Standard there. I'd like to kind of put my own version of this together, blending the different translations. The reason I like the New American Standard there is that word grasped, I think makes it a little more clear than the King James did not consider it robbery. The idea here is not that He was trying to take something. It's not even necessarily that He felt deserving of it. It's more the idea that He didn't find it so valuable that He wouldn't let go of it. He did not find equality with God a thing to be clutched to. Would have been a very literal translation of that Greek term. Instead, He was willing to make Himself of no reputation. He was willing to release that form, those prerogatives, those privileges, those rights. To do what? To be like you and me. To go through what you and I go through in this world. To experience life as a man. All the while remaining God. John 1 and Philippians 2 both make that very clear. His essence did not change. His form changed. How He experienced His existence changed. And He did that voluntarily, and He did that intentionally so that He could experience life as you and I did. If you don't get anything else from our sermon this morning, I want you to get this. The sacrifice of Christ did not begin on the cross. It began at the very least with the incarnation. The willingness to not count the form of God, equality with God, positional equality with God, a thing to be grasped, but to come in the form of a man, to endure what we endure, right up to and including the temptations that plague us through this life. The Word became flesh. And I spent so much time on that because that's the attention getter, right? There's a transition there that can't be overlooked. And it kind of leaves us wondering, well, why would someone do that? I've spent a lot of time this week asking myself if I was in that position, which is really a foolish exercise because I don't even know what that position really is or what that would feel like. But if I had the opportunity to never suffer again and not endure any of the things that we endure, and to just exist eternally in peace and joy and happiness, would I give it up for someone else? And I'm not going to tell you the answer that I came up with, as I searched my heart and mind about that, but I'm sure you can imagine. At the very least, it would be the most difficult thing we could ever do. And yet the Word, Jesus the Christ, did exactly that for us. And then we get some more terms here, and again, the translations in the English are maybe not as helpful as they could be. It says He dwelt among us. Literally, it should be tabernacled or tented among us. And if you've ever been camping, that's a very powerful image, isn't it? Because that's not the most comfortable thing in the world. That's why I haven't done it in about 5 years. And whoever you're tenting with, you get to know them in ways you probably didn't really want to know them. Because there's a closeness involved there. And I think that it does have something to do with what's being said. But I want you to turn back with me, if you would, to Exodus chapter 40. Exodus chapter 40, because we mentioned this last Sunday morning too. This picture here is really, I think, the idea that John is showing us. In many ways, in Jesus, we see a perfected form of what Israel saw from time to time. Exodus chapter 40, the tabernacle is constructed, it's completed. The nation was camped by tribe and then by household. Almost like spokes around a wheel, the tabernacle being the center. And so you'd have the 12 tribes, or 11 of the tribes, I should say, out around that, and the tribe of Levi would kind of camp in a circle around the tabernacle. So all the nation is spread out around this tabernacle. The tabernacle at the middle, it's finished, it's constructed. And I want you to notice, in the cloud, verse 34, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And we went to Kings last week, and we saw in 1 Kings that the same thing happens, or something very similar, when the temple is completed. And really, throughout the rest of the history of Israel, they would look toward either that tabernacle or that temple, and see there the very presence of God, God in His fellowship with them. He was there. It had to be a comforting thing. It was comforting for Daniel even when he was in Babylon and he's praying towards Jerusalem. Can you imagine being on the journey from Sinai to the Promised Land, and there's that cloud, there's that place, there's that representation of God's presence with you. So as comforting as that would have been, I want you to think about the other side of it too. There was still that transcendence. Moses couldn't even go in the tabernacle because the glory of the Lord was there. You get the temple later on. Who can go in it? A select few people. And as far as those who went to the place where God was thought to actually dwell, an even smaller group of people. The majority of people saw tents or brick walls. They knew that God was in there, but there was still this physical barrier, this presence between them. But then the Word became flesh and dwelt not in a tabernacle, not in a temple, but John says, among us. Think about that. God walked among us. As I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think about the many people that touched Jesus throughout His ministry, whether it's a a woman suffering from a hemorrhage of blood for a number of years, whether in her despair, reaching out and touching his garment, what does she find there? She found God there, didn't she? His grace expressed through the healing of her issue, her healing of her disease. Or maybe it's a leper, outcast from society, with no hope whatsoever. But he's able to cry out to this man. I don't believe for a second that leper ever thought Jesus would touch him. Everyone else he was around, they would have thrown rocks at him. They would have said, "Get away, leper." What did Jesus do? See, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so God reached out and touched him. There was no barrier. There was no separation. There was no building that only certain people could enter. Jesus was here. God was here. God tabernacled. He dwelt among us. He became one of us. He became accessible to us. Let's go back to Exodus real quick. Exodus chapter 34, because the next phrase that I want to spend some time with anyway is that he was full of grace and truth. And this is something I'd really not realized before, but it's very powerful. You might remember in Exodus 32 and 34 what's going on. They've committed the sin on Mount Sinai or at Mount Sinai, and they're repenting before God, and God's telling them, let's go, we're going to go to the promised land, and Moses says, I want to see your glory. Moses wanted to know that God was going to go with them, that he wasn't just going to abandon them. And God was promising that he would, and Moses said, well, I want to see your glory, I want to see you, I want to know who I'm talking to. And of course God says you can't do that and live, but what I'll do is I'll put you in the cleft of a rock, and I'll cover you there with my hand, and Moses kind of sees the backside of God as he passes by. How many times have you just sat and wondered what that looked like? What does the backside of God look like? What did that hand look like? Is that pure anthropomorphism? Is he just taking a non-human concept and putting it in human terms? Or did Moses actually see those things? My imagination has run wild on that so many times I can't count it. So I finally figured out what I was doing was completely missing the point. The point's in Exodus chapter 34 and verses 6 and 7. This is the Lord actually passing him by. The Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. That's what Moses saw. He saw the character of God. He saw the nature of God. And what did he find? Loving kindness and truth. We talked about that word a lot in our studies on the Psalms at the end of the year. It's important, isn't it? It's that idea of fidelity. It's faithful love. It's covenant love. It's loyal love. But it's added here with this English word truth, which I think could have just as easily been translated faithfulness. In other words, my promise is true. So I love you loyally, and my promise is true. It's mercy and truth as we find it over there, or grace and truth as we find it in John chapter 1, verse 14. As a matter of fact, that would be a legitimate translation of the actual Hebrew terms found here. So again, what we find out is that when Jesus came, we saw for the first time what Moses saw. But there's no hand hiding us. We see the character and the nature of God. We see His grace and His truth, His loyal love, and His faithfulness. All of this in Jesus Christ. I skipped a phrase. I want to go back and get it. And again, I think the English has kind of failed us a little bit about in this translation. As we read about the only begotten Son of God, and that creates or has led to some questions about the true nature of Jesus. Was He a created being? We were talking out in the foyer about a doctrine that says He was just a man, and then God kind of adopted Him at His baptism, and a little deity entered into Him at that point. Is that what we're talking? No, that's not it. That phrase translated only begotten, the Greek term monogenes, I think is how you say it. I'm not very good with the Greek. But it simply means the one and only. The unique. And so what we see here is the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw His glory. Glory as of the one and only sent from the Father. That's the idea here, full of grace and truth. And so Jesus, the Word, does something for us that no other could do. As a matter of fact, the NIV even translates it very much that way. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. But one and only the unique. He comes in a way that no one else could come, to do something that no one else could do. And I think that's very much part of the power of this passage. He's shown us fellowship with God. He's shown us God's nature. He's shown us God's character in a way that no one else could. You might even notice verse 17 of John chapter 1. He says the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. There's a contrast being made here between what we see through the law and what we see through Christ. And it's a powerful contrast. Moses saw God. He saw the backside of God. He saw the character of God. And that's reflected in the law, as the law was there to deal with sin and allow man to have a way to have fellowship with God despite it. But it could only do so much. It could only do so much. And all the law really was able to do was point to the final sacrifice. But here comes Jesus. Not just bringing us law, although it's hard to deny there's law in the gospel, but showing us something in its fullness. Look at what it says. Grace and truth were realized. In other words, fully formed, able to be seen, realized. You might think about one of those wonderful shows on HGTV where they take an old house and there's someone there, and that person can look at that old house and they can see something else, can't they? Old house is falling apart, the rooms are too small, the carpet's ugly, the wiring's bad, but that person can look at it and they can see something else. And at the beginning of the show, you're like, what do they see there? Right? And then there's the big reveal. And it's realized. Oh, now I get it. Now I see what they saw. The character of God, the nature of God, the grace of God, the faithfulness of God are realized. Fully manifested, fully formed, seen as they could not be otherwise through Jesus Christ. And so, verse 18 has always intrigued me. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, He has explained to Him. This is one of the passages we talk about when we go over to Exodus, and we're like, wait a minute, no one's seen God, but Moses saw God over there in Exodus chapter 34. What's he saying here? He hasn't seen Him like He was to be seen. He got a partial glimpse. He was hidden in the rock, the view partially obscured. It could almost be used as a metaphor for the law itself. It's not that there was no grace under the law itself is grace. It's not that there's no grace before Jesus. The very fact that God interacted with us shows His grace, but it's not fully realized, it's not fully seen, it's not fully understood until what happens? He, the Word, Jesus the Christ, has explained Him. The word means to set forth in great detail, to expound. And here's the beautiful thing. When we study the character of Jesus, we're seeing the Father. Isn't that what Jesus told His disciples in John 14? You've seen me, you've seen the Father. When we go through these Gospels and we see the character of Jesus and we see His attitude toward His Father, we see His attitude toward mankind, we see His attitude toward sin, we see how He deals with unrighteousness, we see how He deals with everything that we see in His life. What we're learning about is the Father. What we're seeing is the Father. And that tells us some things that I think are very important and essential for us to understand. And, one of those things is we're not seeing some aberration, some anomaly. As if God changed somehow intrinsically, as if his character changed to come and be the bondservant, to come in the form of a bondservant, to come here and show us grace and truth, to come here and explain the Father. It's not as if Jesus had to become a different person. It's not as if his character had to change. It's the very opposite. Again, he was showing us what Moses saw in Exodus 34. But he's setting it forth in great detail. He's expounding. The word's actually exegete, which is what we're doing with this passage right now, or at least trying to. And so when we look at Jesus and we see Him in the flesh and we see how He acted, we see who He was, His character, His attitude, His willingness to suffer, His willingness to serve, His resistance of evil, His love of the weak, His mercy, His faithfulness, all of which we see manifested in Jesus again and again and again throughout the Gospels. What we're seeing there is God. That's the God of heaven. That's the God that we're seeking. And so grace and truth are realized in Jesus. We fully see who God is, and then He goes and He makes this sacrifice, and then beyond that sacrifice, He makes this offer for you and I today. And in all of those things, what we're seeing is who God is. He's demonstrating to us, as Peter would talk about it, the divine nature. The divine nature. But He's not just showing it to us. What He's calling on us to do is participate in it. That's exactly what Peter says, isn't it, over in 2 Peter? As he describes that divine nature and he describes all of these concepts that we ought to be making a part of our own lives, He's calling on us to participate in that divine nature. So this is where it becomes very transformative, I think. What does it look like to be a Christian? In very practical terms, what does it look like to be a Christian? Well, it's to be like God. Oh, that's too much. Well, I'm not saying be perfect as God is perfect. We're going to struggle with that mightily, aren't we? But to take on the characteristics, to take on the attitude, to take on, in some sense, the personality, to take on the view of this world and this life, and the view of spiritual things that we see in God. But Sean, that's too much. How can I do that? Look at Jesus. You look at Jesus. And you look at His life. And you look at His example. And you find His footsteps. And you follow after Him. Will that lead me to greatness? Nope. Prosperity? Not in the sense we typically use the word. No. Is that going to free me from the trials and the suffering of this life? Not as long as you're in this life. Well, what will it do? Well, it'll bring me closer to the God of heaven, who loved me so much that He sent His Son to die for me, so that I could have the salvation of my soul. It'll bring me closer to that promise of eternal life, where I finally will be freed from the trials and the sufferings, the tribulations, all the terrible parts of being in this life. Not only will I be freed from them, there'll be no more. They'll be gone. We all want to know the path to that place, don't we? What's the path of the bondservant? The Word who became flesh. It's the path that says I'm willing to give up. It's the path that says I'm willing to serve. It's the path that also says I'm willing to stand against. It's the path that says I won't be distracted. It's the path that says I'll put the Father's will before my own. We could go on and on and on, couldn't we? Simply describing the life of Jesus. He came and He showed us. In Him we realize, we understand the grace and the faithfulness of God, which kind of brings us to another question. What are we going to do with it? What are we going to do about it? Well, I hope that what we'll do is emulate it. Because that's the path to heaven. That's how we find our salvation. And as a matter of fact, if you're here this morning and there's sin in your life, I want you to think about that path. I want you to think about what Jesus has done on our behalf. Not simply the fact, as important as this is, that He died on a cross and His blood was shed. Absolutely, we should rejoice in that, even as we sorrow in it, but more than that. We need to think about everything else He gave up and why He did it. And that simple call that He made everywhere He went. Follow me.